How's it going, guys? White Rabbit here. As many of you know, I just recently built a new computer, and by request, a lot of you guys have asked for me to cover some of the components that I have put into this new system. And so I was going to talk about some of those things and also kind of why I chose what I chose. And I'm also going to give you guys a look at what my system looked like before I actually built it. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alrighty guys, this is the old computer that I was using. I apologize, I've already disassembled it some. I forgot to film part of it and show this to you guys before I started disassembling it. But you can see I took out the hard drives and my optical drive and things. And I've also taken the RAM out of there. But yeah, this is the system that I was working on for, my channel up until now, basically. I built this computer about 4 years ago. And since then, the only thing that I had really updated was I put an SSD in for my boot drive, and I upgraded the video card, which is now in my new rig. So when I was originally planning on fixing the computer, I was planning on reusing the power supply, and I was also planning on reusing the optical drive. Now I couldn't reuse these because these are actually DDR3 and the new interface is DDR4, so I wasn't able to use the existing memory sticks that I had. But yeah, I pulled this out because I was, like I said, going to reuse the optical drive, and listen to this. Yeah, something's broken in there. So actually, what I've kind of concluded is that loud popping sound that I was describing in the previous video, when I was kind of telling you guys kind of what was going on, I think I blew a capacitor or something in this optical drive. And I think that what caused this was both the age of that drive, because I've had this thing since... I mean, look at that. I don't know if you can get an idea of the date of it, but I've had this thing for, let's see, it says March 2008. So this is a, 8-year-old drive or whatever. It's not as bad as I thought it was, actually. But anyway, I think that the power supply contributed to this malfunction. I was doing some research, and I realized that power supplies, I guess, have a limited lifespan, and if you have them for a certain amount of time, especially a lower grade one. This is like kind of one with the bells and whistles, but isn't really like a high level power supply. So I think that's what contributed to this. So that's also why I went with a new power supply for the new rig. Yeah, and then, I mean, you guys know the situation with my motherboard. The problem with the motherboard is that, I have this DDR3 that was in there, but only 2 of my slots were functioning. One of the slots had some kind of malfunction in it and wasn't reading the memory, which yielded it's a paired slot inactive too, apparently. So I was only able to get, actually, I don't know, this is a 4 gig stick, so I was only able to get 8 sticks of RAM, 8 gigs of RAM out of this unit, which, with all the multitasking and things that I do, just isn't gonna cut it. And that's why I was saying I needed more RAM, but I wasn't able to upgrade the RAM because memory slots on the motherboard were malfunctioning. And that's really a bummer because I actually have an AMD CPU in this thing. And I've always built my computers with AMD. Every single time. Since I've been building computers, I've been an AMD type of guy. And I've never built a computer with an Intel processor in it. So this was kind of my first time doing that. And the reason for that is, quite frankly, AMD hasn't really kept up with the times. So I kind of had to bite the bullet on that and just kind of go ahead and build an Intel one. And I gotta tell you, so far so good. Anyway, that's the rig. That's my old rig. That was the situation. You know, again, sorry I didn't catch it while it was all still fully put together, but... Oh, and the other thing I want to point out is look how small this fan is. This fan came out of the first computer I ever built. And I have another one over back in there. Yeah, so... Oh, and this one up here, that's a pretty old one too. So I had itty bitty little fans in it, you know, which basically meant that I usually operated the thing with the side panel completely off, just so I could get some airflow. Yeah, this thing was kind of janky for a while. So now maybe you guys, you know, hopefully you guys now kind of see what I was working with, and yeah. All right, now just to start off with, I want to make something perfectly clear, and that is, you know, for a lot of people who don't really have first-hand experience with video editing or video software or anything like that, and they, you know, they're not too familiar with content creation, to them, what I've built here in this PC may seem completely over the top, but you guys have to realize that, you know, video editing and content creation comes in all different shapes and sizes. And does everyone who makes YouTube videos need a system quite like the one I've put together here? No, absolutely not. But if you're trying to create quality content and trying to put, you know, a whole bunch of edits and do kind of an over-the-top type of professional video production, like I'm trying to do, you're going to need some equipment that's going to be able to keep up with you. So, you know, it's up to each individual to kind of do the research and figure out what components they need for whatever it is they're trying to do. But kind of going along those lines, as you can see, what I have open right now, I have Mozilla Firefox, I have some web browsers up in Google Chrome, I have this screen capture device that I'm using, which is NVIDIA, through NVIDIA, my graphics card. And then I have Premiere open and I have Photoshop open. Now right now I would consider this to be a rather moderate workload. Okay, it's nowhere near outside the realm of possibility for me to be running Premiere and Photoshop at the same time and also have a bunch of web browsers open and, you know, so on and so forth. That's kind of a middle of the road kind of expected what I would have open at any given time. That's not even a real stress test. But just to give you guys an idea, right off the bat, I'm already using 22.8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, considering that my last system had 8 gigs total, yeah, it's it's a good thing that I upgraded here, especially in the RAM department. Now it's funny because originally I actually selected, I actually purchased a 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM for my system, and once everything came in and I had everything accounted for, I realized that I was actually a little bit under budget. Actually the whole build in general came out a lot under what I had anticipated it being, which kind of also helped in expediting the process. But I originally picked 32 gigabytes of RAM, and all the research I did, everybody was saying get as much RAM as you can, get as much RAM as you can. So I went ahead and returned that and opted for 64 gigs instead. And just looking at this, I'm glad I did. But anyway, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself here. Let's go through, let me start off with kind of going through what was in my previous computer. In my previous computer, like I said, I used an AMD processor. I've always been an AMD type of guy. And, you know, this is my first time switching over to Intel, but this was the processor that I had in my computer. This was the motherboard that I was using. It was a Sabertooth. It was like an early Sabertooth edition. This was the RAM. You guys saw that. and this was my graphics card. Now this graphics card I've since put in my current system, and for the time being it's doing a good job. You know, it's a GeForce GTX 760. It's not top of the line by today's standards. It was kind of a middle of the road, maybe a little above middle of the road as far as an enthusiast grade type of graphics card when I purchased it, and that was about a year and a half ago. So that will probably be the next component that I will be upgrading, but for the time being, this is what I have in my current PC. I took this from my last PC. So if we jump over to the current computer, this is what I chose for the current system. I chose an X99 Deluxe motherboard. Now I did this for several different reasons. Actually, originally I was planning on going with a workstation from the from X99 chipset, I believe is what it was called, and that's what I had been planning on from the beginning for several different reasons. But the biggest deterrent in that was that the CPU that corresponded with that motherboard, because the LG11 V3 is not backwards compatible, the chipset that I needed for that motherboard actually ended up costing more than the modern chipset, or more than the modern CPU. So I went ahead and started looking into the X99 series. Now, the thing that I like about the X99 series is that it's based on the workstation format of previous generations. So I felt comfort in knowing that these were, you know, premium parts that are going to last a long time and be really reliable. In addition to that, I chose this particular board because of all the features that I have, and as a way of a insurance that it would be, you know, as future proof as I could get. And the other reason is because of how easy it is to overclock with this motherboard. The CPU that, well, I'll get into the CPU in a minute. It also has wireless capabilities, which I really liked. There have been points in the past when I could have aided from wireless access, even on my desktop. And it also has M.2 allowances, so I really like that. And yeah, just overall, all the research I did said that this was a phenomenal board. I decided to go a little bit above and beyond with the motherboard, just so I didn't fall into the same rut as I did last time. And, you know, I didn't want to make any compromises in that arena, because when you have to replace the motherboard, like, it's a big ordeal. So I did not want to have to replace the motherboard again anytime soon. So that's why I went with the X99 Deluxe. Now, as far as the CPU, I went with the Intel Core i7 5820k Haswell E 6-core 3.3 gigahertz. And that's a LGA 2011 V3 chipset. So this honestly is a really good deal if you're looking for a CPU. I actually got it for a little bit less than this price that it's showing now. It was on special, I guess, a couple days ago, saved like $50 or so. But what's interesting is that the next chipset up from this, the next grade up from this, is the 5930K, and this chip, as you can see, is what, like $200 more than this chip. $200 in difference. Okay. Now on the surface, you might be looking at that and you might be thinking, well, that'll give you $200 more improvement, you know, faster speeds or whatever. And yes, it is, you know, 0.2 gigahertz faster, but really, once you do the overclocking and things, that doesn't really matter a whole lot. The really only difference between this chip and this chip is that this has a let me see if I can pull it up here. This has a max number of PCI Express lanes of 28, and this one has a maximum PCI Express of 40 lanes. Now, what that means is basically on your motherboard, these little slots right here, for, I mean, this is kind of a basic way of explaining it, but basically there's only so much bandwidth that can go through those ports, and these right here. you have, you know, 1x, you have 4x, you have 8x, and 16x or X16 configurations of how of speed grades basically with the PCI Express lanes. Now, if you're going to utilize 40 lanes of PCI Express, you're really only going to do that if you're running in an SLI configuration. And what SLI means is basically if you're running multiple graphics cards at the same time. Now, the thing about video editing is that Adobe Premiere Pro does use CUDA cores in association with the video editing process to aid in the editing process. That's why it's important to have a decent or good, you know, video card while you're doing video editing. But it does not take advantage of SLI configurations or multiple graphics cards for that matter. So it really makes very little to no difference at all when you're doing video editing. It's really meant for gamers. Now, with that in mind, there's really no reason for me to have to dip into those 40 PCI lanes. Okay, so the 28 is more than sufficient. The graphics card that I'm using currently takes 16. The M.2 drive, which I'll get to in a minute, uses 4. So I mean, that right there is 20, and that still leaves me 8 lanes. So I still have room to spare, and I'm using full bandwidth all the bandwidth that I need. So yeah, there's really no need for me to go any higher than that. The next grade up from that, if I did want to see an improvement, the economies of scale just flat out don't work out. This right here is like the premium chipset in this category. It's the 5960X. This chip retails for over $1,000. Okay, and this is a kind of a ridiculously cool chip, but for the price, it's not equal. You know, it's you don't see the extra $600 in cost. You know, the economies of scale don't quite work out. While you may see a little bit of improvement because you are dealing with 2 extra cores, and that's probably the biggest reason, and it also has a little bit bigger cache, the overall benefits just flat out weren't worth it. So, and I couldn't afford that even if I wanted to. But the 5820k, you know, that was a good deal. It's a good price, especially for the quality of CPU that this is. And so yeah, that's why I went with that, and it's going really well so far. Oh, I guess I should show you this. You can see right here it's rated at 3.3 gigahertz. If I jump into my dash with this in combination with the motherboard that I got here, the X99 motherboard, and the overclocking capabilities that it has with this chip, let me just show you what I've been able to get to here. I'm running currently overclocked and this is all stable, by the way. So I ran the stress test, and this is all stable. I'm up 41% of the stock clock. So if the stock is 3.3 gigahertz, that's basically how fast the chip runs. I'm all the way up to 4.8. So yeah, 4.8 gigahertz from 3.3. That is an insane overclock as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if people have gotten much higher than that, but I was not expecting that. I was expecting to overclock this chip to about 4.2 maybe, and the fact that I got to 4.8 is yeah, it's pretty cool. And this puppy flies, I gotta tell you. So yeah, there's that. And then I chose for a boot drive an M.2. This is for my boot drive, and it holds all of my programs, so there's absolutely no delay as far as the software is concerned. And then I don't have a tab pulled up for this, but the old SSDs that were in my previous computer, I've transferred over to this computer. I have my old boot drive, which was an SSD, I've dedicated to the cache that works in conjunction with Premiere and Photoshop and all these things. It works as a working cache for all these files, and then the other SSD is for my working hard disk when I'm working in these programs. So if I download an image or a video or any file that I need for the actual, you know, piece of video that I'm creating, I store that on the SSD. So I have one SSD that stores the hard files, and then the other SSD stores the cache. The program itself is run off the M.2, and they all work in harmony with each other to create a very smooth and quick workflow. Then once the whole any given project is done, then I can clear all the cache off of the initial SSD, and I can take the permanent files that are on the separate SSD and transfer them over to my hard disk for long-term storage. Okay, so that's kind of the logic behind that. And then for the RAM, I was talking about this earlier. I went for the 64 gigabytes of RAM. This is DDR4. It's overclocked at 2800. Keep in mind, guys, that when you buy an overclocked DDR4, all DDR4 comes at 2133, I think, and unless you deliberately overclock it, you're not going to see increase. Now, because I did overclock my chip, the way that the math worked out, I've only been able to get to 2400, but I'm still really happy with that. At the end of the day, when it comes to RAM, the important number here is quantity. How much RAM, how much storage space do you actually have? That's a whole lot more important than the speed of the RAM, because the speed of the RAM in general doesn't make that much of a difference. Now, the other thing that you guys might be wondering is why I chose 64 in 8 sticks. Now, those of you who are perceptive may realize that this motherboard is capable of up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. But it only has 8 sockets, and with this I've got up to 64 gigabytes and 8 sockets. So what I've essentially done is kept myself from being able to upgrade. Now, why did I do that? I did that basically because these Core i7 chips, they are only rated for a maximum memory of 64, and it doesn't even list it on here, but these Core i7 chips are only rated for 64 gigabytes of RAM. They can't do any more than that. Even though the motherboard can, the chipset themselves currently cannot, even the high-level chip. So, that was kind of my logic there. In order to get to the 128 gigabytes of RAM, you would have to be running a Xeon processor, and those are crazy expensive because they're made for like servers and things. And to be honest with you guys, I don't really think that I'm ever going to get up to there. And by the time that consumer grade processors get to a point where they're at a stage of processing 128 gigs of RAM, it'll probably be ready for a whole new computer anyway. So I went ahead and just filled up all the RAM slots with 64 gigabytes, comparable in price. I think it looks a little bit better, and there's this kind of myth in PC realm that it's easier for the computer to read the RAM, even though that's not really true. But yeah, so between all those factors, that's kind of why I went with that. I don't like having, you know, the empty slots in there. I figured I might as well go ahead and fill them up since I'm only going to be doing 64 gigabytes anyway. So that was the logic there. Now, I also went with a water cool system. Now, liquid cooling is something that I've always wanted to try. I've always wanted to do it, and I've never had the gumption to do it. But now they have these new all-in-one radiator type systems, and the way that this works is basically this thing sticks onto your CPU to cool your CPU, because as you're running the computer, the CPU heats up, and you have to disperse the heat somehow, especially if you're overclocking, because when you overclock, you're basically putting more voltage into the chip. It heats up the chip, and it could, you know, ruin your chip if it gets too hot. So you have to make sure that your chip stays really cool. So the way that this works is you have your little radiator, and you have fluid that runs through, and these fins, you have a fan on top of these fins, which airflow goes through and is dissipated and gets transferred into the liquid. The liquid goes down these pipes onto the heating pad and makes contact with your CPU chip. So we have cool liquid that comes in, cools up the chip. The heat that is emitted from the chip is transferred into the liquid, returning to the radiator, and so it creates kind of this whole cycle here. And that's kind of the principle behind it, and it works really well, and that's part of the reason why I was able to overclock to, you know, the degree that I was able to. So next up, as you guys know, I needed to get a new power supply as well. I went with this power supply. This is actually probably the nicest power supply I've ever seen in my life. The packaging for this was phenomenal, and it's just, it feels really, really, you know, it feels quality. It feels like quality, you know. That's the best way I could describe it. It's a gold standard, and the other thing that is really cool about this is that the reason it says 100% Japanese 105 Celsius capacitors is because what happens with this power supply is that it actually turns off. The fan turns off because the capacitors are able to withstand higher heat loads. And the fan itself, in addition to that, is a very quiet fan. And the overall performance quality of this is 850 watts is the one I got. But it also runs extremely quiet because it doesn't have to run the fan all the time. So that brings me to my next point. I also purchased these fans. I upgraded the case fans and the fans that came on the water cooler. I did that because one of the things that I was really concerned about in this build was how loud the computer was. I record my audio right next to my computer, and I have always in the past had to do an extra step in the rendering process. I would have to use a program right here called Audition, Adobe Audition, and I would actually have to do noise cancellation in order to take out the background noise that was created by my last computer. And I figured that if I could make this computer quiet, or quiet enough at least, I wouldn't have to do that extra step, and it would save me some time in the long run. So that's what I did, and I did not think that it would turn out as well as it did. I was actually contemplating returning these after I initially made the purchase, and then I put them in the computer and I was like, wow, because these things are really quiet. So I'm actually not going to do any noise cancellation on this video. You guys can tell me what you think, how you think it sounds as far as the background noise and stuff. And yeah, I mean, that's my PC is basically silent between this and the power supply and the liquid cooling. I mean, the loudest thing in the computer right now is my video card, and even that doesn't make that much noise. So anyway, I think that's pretty much it, guys. You know, aside from that, I have my old storage drives, so I have about 6 terabytes of storage in there currently, which is already just about maxed out. And I have those SSDs I told you about. Oh, I got an optical drive. I have a Blu-ray optical drive now. So I'm able to rip Blu-rays from to sample in videos. I'm able to do that from Redbox movies now, where before I was only able to do DVDs. So now I can do DVDs and Blu-rays. So that kind of helps out with that. And yeah, so I think that's pretty much it, guys. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. I guess you know, I know you guys were kind of asking for kind of a breakdown of the components I used in the new build here. And again, guys, I have to say it. Thank you guys so much to those of you who contributed, and even those who were just supportive throughout this whole process. And you know, those of you who weren't able to contribute but still, you know, sent out some prayers and were you know, real supportive of the whole process in general. I really appreciate that. And I want you guys to know that every single dollar that we take in for this channel goes to the channel, you know, in some way, shape, or form. Every dollar that we take in goes to the channel, okay? So whether it's upgrading the computer, whether it's getting more storage space, whether it's the programs that we use, you know, whatever it is, it goes to this channel, okay? And you know, I kind of felt like maybe this would be a good way for you guys to visualize part of that. You know, half of this computer was funded by previous months' Patreon contributions. So, and then the other half was, well, I would say probably about 80 to 90% of this computer was funded between Patreon and PayPal. So, yeah. Like I said, guys, every dollar that we take in goes directly to the channel. Okay? In one way, shape, or another. And thank you guys so much for contributing. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much. Yeah. That's all I got, guys. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, if it was helpful. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks, and God bless.